The apartment was glowing before Chelsea Booker even unlocked the door. That was the first sign something wasn't right. She stood in the hallway for a moment, key already in hand, staring at the thin line of warm light bleeding beneath the door. Han Taemin was in Tokyo. She had driven him to the airport herself 4 days ago, stood on the curb while he pulled his carry-on from the back seat, watched him pause before walking through the terminal doors as if he wanted to say something more than goodbye. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow night. The light made no sense. She unlocked the door slowly. The apartment was silent. Chelsea stepped inside and set her bag down near the entrance. She had come to water the plants, a small thing Taemin had mentioned almost absently before leaving, and which she had taken seriously because she took everything seriously. She moved toward the kitchen, then stopped. The sculptural vase near the floor-to-ceiling windows had been moved. Not dramatically. No one had knocked it over or broken anything. It had simply been placed perhaps 14 inches to the left of where it had always stood, close enough to the original position that most people would have walked past it without registering the difference. But Chelsea Booker designed spaces professionally. She had spent years training her eye to read rooms the way other people read faces. The vase was wrong. The entire left side of the room was wrong. Something about the balance had shifted. She stood very still. Then a woman's voice came from behind her. "I moved it back where it belongs." Chelsea turned. Han Taemin's mother was seated in the living room. She was elegant. A cup of tea sat on the side table beside her, untouched and cool, suggesting she had been here long enough for it to stop steaming. She studied Chelsea with a kind of attention that had nothing warm in it. Chelsea kept her voice even. "How did you get in?" "I have a key," the woman said simply. "It's my son's apartment." Then, and clearly, so do you. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight. Taemin's mother, Chelsea would learn later that she went by Madam Han, gestured toward the sofa across from her with one hand. The gesture was gracious and absolute, the kind royalty uses when they want you to feel invited rather than commanded, even though the difference is only technical. Chelsea didn't sit. Madam Han observed this without reaction. "You shouldn't have been given a key this quickly." That landed hard. Not because it was cruel. It was delivered in the same even tone as everything else, but because of what it revealed. This woman already knew exactly who Chelsea was. She had done her research before walking into this apartment, before arranging herself in this chair, before letting the tea go cold. The surprise Chelsea had felt walking through the door had been entirely one-sided. "My son makes very few emotional decisions," Madam Han continued. "This one surprised me." "You came here," Chelsea said carefully, "to discuss your son's dating life while he's overseas." "I came because someone needed to." There was no apology in it. No acknowledgement that entering her adult son's apartment while he was out of the country and then waiting in the dark for his girlfriend to arrive was anything other than completely reasonable. Madam Han folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who had never once second-guessed a decision she made on behalf of someone she loved. Chelsea looked at her steadily. She had sat across from difficult people before. She knew how to stay still in a room that was trying to move her. Madam Han began to speak about her son's life in the way a person speaks about territory they have spent decades mapping. The obligations. The danger. The weight of a name that carried not just history but active consequence. She did not raise her voice once. She did not threaten. She simply described a world and then turned to look at Chelsea the way a curator might regard a beautiful object that had been placed in the wrong gallery. "You create beautiful spaces," she said finally. "Controlled. Curated. Predictable." A small pause. "My son's life is not." "I'm aware," Chelsea said. "Are you?" It wasn't a question. "You design rooms where every element is chosen, every angle is considered, everything serves a purpose you predetermined. That is a remarkable skill." She tilted her head slightly. "But with respect, you are not built for what follows him." Chelsea felt the precision of it, the compliment embedded in the dismissal. She said, "You decided that before meeting me." Madam Han did not answer. Which was the answer? And what happened after that was the moment everything between them changed. Subscribe if this is your first time here. Stay with me, because this story is about to get more interesting. Chelsea Booker had built her firm the difficult way, talent first, connections later. By 29, Booker Design Group had redesigned luxury hotels in 3 countries and developed the kind of reputation wealthy clients competed for quietly. The sole commission was supposed to be another project. Then she met Han Tae-min. The sole project was a luxury hotel redesign in Gangnam, the kind of commission that changed careers permanently if it succeeded. 3 weeks into construction, an investor publicly challenged her materials budget in front of the contractors, executives, and half the project team. "You're designing emotions, not buildings," he said. Chelsea set down her specifications folder with complete calm. "I'm designing spaces people trust enough to live inside," she said. "There's a difference." He laughed. Not a genuine laugh. He turned to address the room rather than her, which was the particular disrespect of someone who had decided she wasn't worth the direct conversation. "She understands walls," he said, "but not." A voice came from the back of the room. Calm. Quiet. The kind of quiet that stops a conversation not because it's loud, but because it carries weight most voices never develop. "You're speaking to the only person here who understands what this building needs." Han Tae-min stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at the investor. He was looking at the blueprints on the table with the mild interest of a man reviewing something he had already considered. He said it the way he might say the weather was changing, not as a confrontation, but as a correction of fact. The investor shifted his entire posture inside of 3 seconds. Afterward, when the room had cleared and Chelsea was rolling up her specifications, Tae-min approached. She looked at him directly. "I had it handled." "I know," he said. "That's why I waited." She studied him for a moment. He had the stillness of someone who noticed more than he said. His attention, when he gave it, had a quality that felt different from the way most people paid attention, less like watching and more like understanding. Chelsea said, "Are you invested in this project?" "I am now." He returned to the site 2 days later. Then again. His explanations for appearing shifted from investment-related to increasingly transparent, and Chelsea found herself not minding the transparency. He noticed details most people ignored. One afternoon he stood in the unfinished lobby for almost a minute before saying, "You're adjusting the lighting for something emotional." Chelsea looked at him carefully. "Most people think it's aesthetic. Most people aren't paying attention," he said. A few days later, walking through a half-finished corridor, he said quietly, "You build spaces that make people exhale." She thought about that sentence much longer than she meant to. Coffee after meetings became longer conversations. Then the meetings became excuses for the conversations. Chelsea eventually realized she had started expecting him to appear. One evening Chelsea fell asleep at her studio table sometime after midnight with lighting plans still spread open beneath her hands. When she woke up, her laptop had been closed. A cup of tea sat beside her. And Tae-min was across the room quietly reviewing material samples like he had always belonged there. He looked up once. "You needed sleep," he said. That was all. But she thought about that moment for days. The project collapsed on a Thursday night. A supplier pulled key materials with almost no notice, and Chelsea was still on site near midnight trying to rebuild an impossible timeline when Tae-min arrived. He looked at the scattered plans once before asking, "Show me what failed." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Let me fix it." Just that. And somehow it was exactly what she needed. By 2 in the morning, she had a workable path forward. When she looked up from her notes, he was watching her with an expression she didn't immediately classify. "You did that yourself," he said. "You helped." "I listened." She understood the distinction he was making. And she thought about it for a long time after he left. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, Chelsea brought revised blueprints to his apartment. He had asked to see the updated atrium specifications, and she had been nearby. He spread them across the dining table and studied them with the same focused attention he gave everything. He asked 2 precise questions. She answered. He nodded once, the way he did when he had finished understanding something. Then he walked briefly to another room. He came back holding a key. He set it on the blueprints in front of her without ceremony. "In case you ever need somewhere quiet." Chelsea looked at the key. Then at him. "That sounds dangerously personal." "It is," he said. No speech. No explanation. Just the fact of it, laid out plainly, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. She picked up the key. Later, sitting in her car outside his building with the key in her palm, she stayed longer than she needed to. Not because she was uncertain. Because some gestures arrive quietly and still change everything, and she wanted to let it be exactly what it was before the rest of her life started moving again. Now, standing in his apartment with his mother watching her from the living room chair, Chelsea turned the memory over once before setting it aside. She moved through the room slowly, not toward the door or toward the sofa, but in the careful way she moved through any space she was trying to read. And she began to notice things she had missed on the first pass. The books on the shelf near the window were arranged differently than she remembered. Not dramatically, just 2 or 3 titles shifted, the kind of adjustment someone makes when they're reorganizing a shelf and decide partway through that they have no right to be doing it and stop. The angle of the reading chair had changed by roughly 10 degrees. A small ceramic piece on the console table near the hallway had been rotated to face a different direction. Chelsea stopped moving. She turned to look at Madame Hahn, who was watching her with an expression that had become, in the last 10 seconds, slightly less composed than before. "How many times have you been here?" Chelsea said, while he was away. "I check on the apartment occasionally." "How many times?" Madame Hahn's chin lifted almost imperceptibly. The pause lasted exactly long enough to be a decision. "Why would you ask me that, Dot?" Chelsea looked at her steadily. "You've been walking through his home deciding who belongs here." "I've been protecting my son." No, Chelsea's voice was still even. Still controlled. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, something that moved through her words without raising them. "You've been controlling the outcome before anyone else could speak." Madame Hahn stood. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with the posture of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her presence. She moved to the front door with the unhurried certainty of a person who has already decided how a scene ends. She opened it, turned, and stood beside the open doorway with one hand resting lightly on the door. She said nothing. She simply waited. The silence was extraordinary in its precision. There was no threat in it, no raised voice, no explicit demand. Just an open door and a woman standing beside it with the absolute composure of someone who expected to be obeyed. It was the most deliberate insult Chelsea had ever received because it wore the costume of graciousness. It said, "I won't throw you out. I'll simply stand here until you understand that you should leave." Chelsea stood in the center of the room. She was aware of the open doorway, the silence, the evening light coming through the windows. She was aware of everything Madame Hahn had said about danger and obligation and survival and sentiment. She was aware that somewhere in another time zone, a man who had pressed a key into her hand and said it was personal was likely asleep and had no idea this was happening. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door without rushing. She stopped just before the threshold and looked at Madame Hahn directly. "I don't compete for belonging," she said. "Not in my work. Not in anyone's home. And not for a man who isn't here to witness this." She walked out. Han Taemin landed in Seoul the following evening. The flight had been delayed by 40 minutes, which meant he was already later than intended. His driver was waiting. The city moved past the windows on the way home. He unlocked his own apartment door and stepped inside and felt, immediately, that something was wrong. Not the temperature. Not any visible evidence. Something subtler, the way a room holds the emotional residue of events that happened inside it. He had learned a long time ago to trust that sense. He stood in his own entrance for a moment, reading the air before moving farther in. He saw the key on the kitchen counter. It stopped him completely. It sat in the exact center of the marble surface. Perfectly aligned. Intentional. The way a person places something when they want the placement itself to communicate. Like even her goodbye had been carefully designed. He stared at the key for a long moment before checking his voicemail. Chelsea's voice was calm. "Your mother came while you were gone. I left your key on the counter. I think you deserve to know." He set his phone down slowly. He walked into the living room. His mother was seated in the same chair she always chose, with the particular composure of a woman who believed she had done something difficult but necessary and had not yet been told otherwise. Taemin looked at her for a moment. Then, she was here. "Yes, you let yourself in again. I was concerned about." "How many times," he said, "have you entered my apartment while I was away?" The silence was different from the one he had walked into. This one had weight behind it, the weight of a question she had been hoping wouldn't be asked directly. "3, she said finally. He went very still. That stillness was something people who knew him well understood as more serious than anger. Anger moved. This didn't. This was the stillness of a person recalibrating their understanding of something they had trusted. She noticed things had been moved. His mother said nothing, which confirmed it entirely. "You turned my home into a test," he said. "One she never agreed to take. I was protecting you." No, his voice didn't rise. It hardened in a way that was quieter and more final than raised volume would have been. "You were deciding for me." He looked at the key on the counter. He thought about what it had cost her to leave it there the way she had, not thrown down, not left on the floor near the door, but placed in the center of the counter with the same care she gave to every space she moved through. "She returned the key," he said. "She respected my home more while leaving it than you did while inside it." His mother's composure shifted. Not dramatically, she was not a woman who expressed things dramatically. But something in her face moved, some arrangement that had been carefully maintained for the length of this conversation. "You're choosing her," she said. "I'm choosing the person who understands boundaries." He picked up the key and held it for a moment. "You need to leave." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said quietly. "Go home." She gathered herself with the dignity of a woman who had not been asked to leave a room very many times in her life, and she left. The door closed. The apartment was silent again. Taemin stood in his kitchen for a long time, holding a key that had been returned to him, thinking about all the things that had happened inside his apartment while he was in another country, trusting the people who mattered to him. He went to her studio the next evening. The building was dark except for one window on the fourth floor, a warm, amber rectangle in the face of the building that he recognized immediately. He had stood in enough of her spaces to know what her working light looked like. It was different from the overhead lighting people default to, different from the cold white efficiency of late-night offices. She lit her workspace the way she lit her projects, with the intention of making it a place where thinking could breathe. She buzzed him in without asking who it was. He took the stairs. The studio was open, her assistant had already gone, the reception area dark, only the back workspace illuminated. She was standing at a long table covered in material samples and lighting specifications, comparing two fabric swatches against a printed color reference. She did not immediately look up. "I confronted her," he said. Chelsea set down the swatches. She looked at him with the same direct attention she gave everything. Not softened by the fact that this was an emotional conversation. Not performing warmth she didn't currently feel. She admitted she'd been there 3 times, he said. "I asked her to leave." Chelsea was quiet for a moment. Then, she was afraid. That surprised him. He looked at her carefully. She built her entire understanding of what protects you around being the person who controls the variables, Chelsea said. And then a variable appeared that she couldn't control. She paused. "Fear makes people do things they'd never admit to if you asked them directly. That doesn't excuse it." "No," she said. "But fear explains behavior people would never admit to otherwise." He studied her face. He had expected, not coldness exactly, but the self-protective distance of someone who had been significantly disrespected and was managing the damage. Instead, she looked like someone who had already processed the experience and came out the other side carrying something more useful than grievance. "Fix this properly with her," she said. He blinked. "You want me to?" "I'm not interested in becoming the reason you lose your mother." She picked up one of the swatches again, held it at a different angle toward the light. "I'm interested in whether you can protect boundaries without destroying relationships." He watched her working, the way she held the fabric, the way her attention moved across the material reference, the way she stood in her own workspace with the ease of someone who had built the environment to fit her mind. He thought about everything she had said and hadn't said since he walked in. "You changed something," he said. She looked up. "In the studio. The lighting's different from last time." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression loosened, very slightly at the edges. "You noticed," she said. "I always notice." And there it was, not a large smile, not a performance of relief or reconciliation, but something genuine and small and warm breaking through the controlled composure she had been holding since the night she walked out of his apartment with her bag and her dignity intact. It was the smile of a person who had been known accurately, which is a different thing from being complimented, and rarer. He met his mother for dinner 3 days later. A restaurant she had chosen, which he had agreed to because it was important that she felt she hadn't lost everything. He arrived first and ordered tea and sat looking at the city through the window until she came in. The conversation was not easy. He told her what Chelsea had said, not immediately, but after his mother had tried 3 different framings of her behavior, and he had quietly declined each one. She said, he told her, that she thinks you were afraid. His mother went still. She said fear explains behavior people would never admit to directly. She said that, Yes. Something happened in his mother's face that he hadn't seen in a very long time. A softening that was not weakness, but something more like the release of a held breath. I thought, she said slowly, if you chose someone outside our world, eventually you would resent her for it. And blame her. And then you would lose both of us. I would resent anyone who made me choose dishonestly. She told me to fix this with you, he said. Before I came here. She specifically said that. His mother looked at him. She said she's not interested in being the reason you and I lose each other. Something moved across his mother's face that was not quite composed and was not trying to be. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then, very quietly, I handled it badly. Yes, he said. You did. He didn't soften it. He had learned from watching Chelsea that the people you love deserve the accuracy of what's true, not the comfort of what's easier to hear. His mother asked, eventually, toward the end of dinner, whether she could meet Chelsea properly. Neutral ground. Not the apartment. Not any territory where the dynamic had already been established. I'll ask her, he said. The penthouse project finished on a Thursday. Chelsea always arrived before the client on reveal days, not for her own sake, but because she liked one last walkthrough alone, one final conversation with the space before other people began living in it and making it something beyond her design. She moved through the finished room slowly, adjusting a lampshade by 2 degrees, centering a bowl on a console table, standing in the center of the main living area and listening to the room the way a musician listens to an instrument before a performance. She was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, adjusting the angle of the light panels by a fraction, when she heard the door. Taman stood in the entrance, looking at the room. He was early. She had known he would be. He moved through the space without speaking. He stopped in the center of the room where the light fell in the particular way she had spent 2 days calibrating, and he looked at the ceiling and the walls, and the way the materials related to each other. You changed the entire mood of the room, he said. She kept her attention on the light panel. The original brief wanted something impressive. That's a different thing. What did you give them instead? Somewhere to exhale. He was quiet for a moment. Most people only notice furniture, she said. I notice what matters to you. She finished with the panel. She turned and looked at him standing in the middle of a room she had built carefully from nothing, watching her with the same complete attention he had given her from the beginning. And this time she smiled fully. Not carefully. Not partially. Just honestly. Some people ask to be chosen. Chelsea Booker never did. And maybe that was exactly why he kept choosing her. When Chelsea placed that key in the center of his counter, did you understand what she was really saying? Not anger. Not revenge. Just dignity. So tell me honestly in the comments, would you have walked out the way Chelsea did, or would you have stayed and fought for the relationship right there? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.